Welcome to Interpreting the Nazir, a Mishnah Tractate Nazir. We have the pleasure of learning this morning with Rabbi Silber on which is on a class that is some degree of a continuation from his previous one, where previously early in the spring we learned about the Nazir and Tanakh. Now we get to learn with Mishnah. In this class, the Mishnah devotes an entire tractate to the discussion of Nazir, the biblical Nazirite. In this course, we shall examine how the Mishnah understands the person and institution of the Nazir. Our analysis will focus on the Mishnah's interpretation of the relevant biblical texts, alongside discussion of the mishnaic presentation of the role and status of the Nazir. This class, like all of our other Mishnah offerings, is presented in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. If you have a copy of Mishnah that you prefer to follow along with, excellent. Feel welcome to use that. Otherwise, I will be sharing sources on the screen.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's begin. So this class will be focusing on the Mishnah, specifically, as Kayla mentioned, mishnaic of Nazir. And the overall interest here is to see how the Mishnah presents the Nazir. Now, let me just begin by a brief introduction about Mishnah in general, and then we'll get to some of the specific mishnayot of this tractate. So there's a lot of, just by way of introduction, and please feel free to speak up if you have questions. Let me just start by saying that the Mishnah is one of the central texts of the Jewish tradition. And one could make the argument, I think, that once you get beyond the Torah, it is the central text of the Jewish tradition. It is the central text of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition. The Gemara, the Talmud, is fundamentally begins as a discussion of the Mishnah, an interpretation of the Mishnah. Of course, it goes its own path in many directions, but the Mishnah is the central text of the oral tradition. Now, apart from the Mishnah, which is one central text of the oral tradition, there's also another set of central texts of the tradition, and that's what's called Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha is the set of writings. They're written down. All of this presumably initially was not written down. I'll come back to that. But Midrash Halacha is a commentary, a rabbinic commentary on the verses of the Torah. And there are several well-known Midrashei Halacha. There's the Mechilta, which is a commentary on the halachic sections of the book of Shemot, of Exodus. There are actually two Mechiltas. And then there is the Sifra, which is the Torah Kohanim, a commentary on the book of Vayikra. Then there's the Sifrei, which is on Bamidbar and Dvarim, and Sifrei Zuta as well. So these are the core texts of the oral tradition. One of the questions that the scholars deal with is what is the relationship between these two central texts? That is the Mishnah on one hand and the Midrash Halacha on the other. And there's a debate, actually, in terms of which came first, which is a very important debate. In other words, was the initial core rabbinic text Midrash Halacha, which is basically a running commentary on the halachic sections of the Torah. The Mishnah is not. The Mishnah does not go in the order of the verses of the Torah fundamentally. There is some ordering in the Mishnah there as well, but fundamentally the Mishnah goes by topics. The Mishnah is topical. The Midrash Halacha is written in conjunction with the biblical verses. So one of the questions is which of these came first, and what is the influence on one on the other, which is a very fundamental question in terms of Jewish tradition, Jewish interpretation. How does one see the Mishnah? Is the Mishnah simply playing out of the Midrash Halacha, or is it the reverse, that the Midrash Halacha is in a way addressing the Mishnah? But be that as it may, these are the two core central texts of the tradition of the oral tradition. And of course, we have the Talmud, the Gemara, which is playing off both but primarily the Mishnah. So that's one point to be, one question, which is an important question. Our focus, of course, will be the Mishnah. Now, when I say the Mishnah, so the Mishnah is topical, and there are 6, what's called starim, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. There are 6 fundamental areas that the Mishnah deals with. And they are basically, the first one is called Zra'im, which deals with the agricultural rules, begins with the Sechet Brachot. Then we have Moed, which deals with the festivals. Then we have Nashim, that deals with women. That is to say, it deals with things like marriage and divorce, etc. Levirate marriage, come back to that. Then, of course, we have Nazikin, which deals with torts, criminal law, torts, etc. And the last 2 starim are Kodshim, deals with sacred objects or sacred places, sacrifices, etc. And finally, Tarot, which deals with ritual purity and impurity, Tumah and Tara. These are the 6 Sidarim. Now, where do we find Masechet Nazir? Where would you put Tractate? If you were arranging Tractate Nazir and you were putting it somewhere, where would you put it? That's a very interesting question if you think about it, because if you ask me where I would have put it, I would have put it probably in Kodshim, that deals with sacred things. Because when you open up the Torah, and all the rules of the Nazir are found in one place in the Torah, which is chapter 6 of Bamidbar, and the Torah calls the Nazir Kadosh. The Torah says the Nazir is Kadosh. It sounds like the hair that he doesn't cut is also Kadosh. It culminates in a set of sacrifices, and the hair is even thrown in together with the sacrifices, or is put under one of the sacrifices, which terminates the Nazir's Nazirut. Yes, me. I would have probably would have put it in Kodshim. However, that is not where the author of the Mishnah, who is presumed to be Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is the author of the Mishnah, that's not where Rabbi put it. The Tractate of Nazir is not found in Kodshim, but surprisingly, it's found in Seder Nashim. It's a tractate that we find it in the section that's called Nashim, women. And then the question is, one of the preliminary questions we can ask ourselves here is why, in fact, did Rebbe put Nazir in Seder Nashim? That's a very interesting question. So let me just address that question very briefly now. And it touches on something very basic about Tractate Nazir. Let's begin by pointing out that within each Seder, there is a kind of internal order. And the order is actually very interesting. Let's take, for example, Seder Nashim. So it begins, the first tractate of Nashim is Tractate Yevamot, that deals with levirate marriage. That's the first tractate. The second tractate is Masechet Ketuvot, which deals with the Ketuvah, but more broadly deals with obligations of wife towards husband and husband towards wife. That's the second tractate. The tractate after Ketuvot is Tractate Nidarim, that deals with vows. By vows, I mean not vows to donate things to the temple or to bring sacrifices, but Nidarim as described by the Mishnah, which is when a person takes upon herself or himself some kind of extraordinary obligation, something that's not normally forbidden. I take a vow that this food should be forbidden to me. Spaghetti is forbidden to me. That's a neder. And that's what Tractate Nidarim deals with fundamentally. And it moves to other areas as well. For example, how does one get out of a vow that one has taken? Hatarat Nidarim. And in conjunction with Hatarat Nidarim, the last chapter of Masechet Nidarim deals with the question of hafarat nidarim. Because the Torah says also in the book of Bamidbar that if a woman or a young woman takes a vow, that when she's still considered a minor, her father, upon hearing the vow, has the right to terminate the vow. It's called hafarat nidarim. He only has the right to terminate it on the day that he hears the vow. But if on the day he hears it, he says, I don't want it, it's terminated. And the same is true for a married woman vis-a-vis her husband. If she takes a neder, the husband has the right only on the day that he hears of it, on that one day, to abrogate the vow. That's called hafarat nidarim. That's the next tractate in Nashim. The tractate after nidarim is Nazir. It's our tractate, the Nazirite. The tractate after Nazir is Sota. That's the parsha of the Sota, which woman who is accused by her husband of infidelity. And then there's a whole procedure. He can take his wife to the temple, and she has to undergo this ordeal of the Sota to find out whether she's truly been disloyal or not. She had an affair, etc. And after you get to Sota, then we have Tractate Gittin, which deals with divorce. And the last tractate of Seder Nashim is Kedushin, which deals with how one creates a marriage. That is the order of Seder Nashim. Now, anybody who hears about the Seder Nashim must say, any rational person would say, this is one of the most cockeyed orderings we've ever encountered. Why in the world, when you deal with Seder Nashim, for example, is the last one Kedushin? I would have put it first. First Kedushin, then it would go with Ketuvot, the obligations, then perhaps levirate marriage. And in general, why is Nidarim and Nazir in Seder Nashim altogether? And why this particular order? So that's a wonderful question, which the Gemara itself from time to time asks this question. Now, what is very curious is that actually there is a very simple answer to the order of the things in Seder Nashim and in general in the Mishnah. Now, I'm not explaining why Nidarim and Nazir are in Nashim. I'll get back to that. But what about the order in general? The order of the Mishnah is a big deal, but the simplest answer, which all academics accept to be obvious, but when you read the Gemaras, it doesn't seem like it's obvious to them. Well, at least they pretend it's not obvious because they give other reasons. But the truth of the matter is that the simplest way to understand it is that the mishnaiot in all of the Shas are in size order. It goes from the Mishnah with the most chapters to the Mishnah with the fewest chapters. The Mishnah with the fewest chapters in Seder Nashim happens to be Kedushin, has only 4 chapters. The Mishnah with the most chapters is Yevamot, levirate marriage. So it is in size order. Having said that, let's come back to the question of why Nazir is here in the first place. And it would appear that Nazir is here in the first place because it follows Masechet Nidarim. There is a connection between Tractate Nidarim on one hand and Tractate Nazir on the other. And now, why is Nidarim in Seder Nashim? Well, presumably Nidarim is in Seder Nashim. The Talmud itself asked that question. The Rambam wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, by the way. I'll come back to that. He actually wrote a commentary as a young person. He writes a commentary on the Mishnah. His great magnum opus, or one of his 2 great works in the Rambam, is the Mishnah Torah. He called his work, which is a work which puts forward all the laws of the Talmud, but he orders them differently. And he called it Mishnah Torah. And not only did he call it Mishnah Torah, he wrote it in mishnaic Hebrew. Many of the Rambam's other works are not written in Hebrew altogether, they're written in Arabic. But he wrote this not just in Hebrew, but in mishnaic Hebrew. Once again, you see how central the Mishnah is. But Nidarim presumably is in Seder Nashim because the Torah, when it talks about Nidarim, the main focus is about the woman who takes a neder. and the right of the father and a husband under certain circumstances to annul the vow. That's probably how the Nazir gets into Seder Nashim. And the important point for our purposes is that, and we'll see this, that the initial focus of the Mishnah in Nazir is the fact that the way a person becomes a Nazir is by taking a vow. That actually is the first verse when the Torah speaks of Nazir in Bamidbar, chapter 6. Ish Alisha ki yafli lindar neder Nazir. A man or woman. It's striking that the Torah mentions a woman as well. We'll get back to this later on. But man or woman who pronounces the vow of the Nazirite. It's called neder Nazir. And because it's called neder Nazir, as we'll see, this is actually how Tractate Nazir begins. That's how the Mishnah starts, with rules relating to taking vows. So that makes sense. And the tractate that follows it, Masechet Sota, is also related, presumably, to Tractate Nazir. In the Torah, those two chapters come side by side. In the Torah, Sota is chapter 5 of Bamidbar, and Nazir is chapter 6. In the Torah, actually, Sota precedes Nazir. In the Mishnah, Nazir follows Sota, but the two, as we will see, are actually connected by the Mishnah. So that's where we find Tractate Nazir. And it's actually very interesting, by the way, the other point about things being in size order. By the way, the Quran is that way. The Quran is completely in size order. The longest surahs at the beginning. I think there's one exception there, but basically it's in size order. So size is interesting. I'll tell you another place where you have size order, from smaller to bigger, point that Kasuto made. That when the Torah gives names, very often, a list of names, it gives it in size order, from smaller to bigger. For example, Noah's children. Noah has 3 sons, the Torah says, Shem, Cham, and Yefet. Shem, Cham, and Yefet. And when you study the Torah, you realize immediately that that's not the order of their birth. The oldest one is clearly Yefet. The youngest one actually is Cham. So the order is Yefet's the oldest, Cham is second, and Shem is the youngest. That appears to be the order. But in the Torah, it's Shem, Cham, and Yefet. And Kasuto points out that very often, when the Torah gives a list of names, it's in size order, smallest to biggest. In the Mishnah, the size is biggest to smallest, most chapters. Biggest chapter to smallest chapter. Okay, that's the first little introduction to the Mishnah. Let me stop here for a moment. If anybody has comments or questions about anything I said so far, please speak up.
You can also ask questions in chat if you either are an attendee or don't want to, unmute yourself.
We'll be picking up, and some of these things will come up later as we get to the actual mishnaic of Nazir.
All right. Rabbi Silber, now that we're getting started, where should people open up to?
Not yet, one second, not yet. We're going to open up to the first Mishnah in Tractate Nazir in a couple of minutes. I just want to frame this for us in terms of the Mishnah. It really is, as I say, it's such a central text of our tradition, and it is in a certain way more accessible than some of the other texts, as the Gemara, for example. The Mishnah is much briefer. It's less complicated vocabulary. So the Mishnah is something that really people should think about taking upon themselves to study the Mishnah. And actually, at Drisha, we're planning to do a very big project about the study of Mishnah in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. It's part of a big Mishnah project. So that could be very, very interesting. And you really get a sense, the idea, Mishnah is good, but you get a real sense, a big picture of what this Torah Shabbat Peh is really about. Now, let me make a couple of other points about the place of the Mishnah in our tradition before we jump into the actual mishnaic of Tractate Nazir. The Mishnah, of course, is a central text, and the Mishnah as I mentioned earlier, was redacted by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. That's what the tradition tells us, Yehuda HaNasi. And it is the collected work of what the Talmud calls the Tanaim. In general, the Talmud distinguishes between the Tanaim, that is up to the time of Yehuda, pretty much up to the time of Yehuda HaNasi. And Yehuda HaNasi collects the opinions of the Tanaim who came before him. He also includes often his own opinion in the Mishnah. And up to that point, up to the Mishnah is a dividing line between the Tanaim and the Amoraim, more or less the dividing line. He also has pupils. Now, we talk about the Tanaim, the Tanaitic material, which is collected by the Yehuda HaNasi. A lot of the material expresses the views of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva's students. That's an important point to note. I'll come back to that later as well. However, there was also Tanaitic material that did not make it into the Mishnah. Rabbi did not simply quote everything he knew from the Tanaim. Rabbi was very selective. But other statements of the Tanaim, other teachings of the Tanaim, we have access to other teachings of the Tanaim, and in two ways. Number one, the Talmud itself often quotes what's called a Braita. A Braita is a statement by a Tana, or more than one Tana, but it's a Braita. Bara in Aramaic means outside. So a Braita means the statements of the Tanaim that are outside, that are not found in the Mishnah. But they are Tanaitic, and they carry a lot of weight, typically not as much weight as the material found in the Mishnah. So that's what's called the Braita. Now, in addition to the Braita, Braitas are individual statements, not collections, but we actually have a whole collection of other Tanaitic material, not in the Mishnah, but in what is called the Tosefta. And there actually, I think, is one set of manuscripts of the Tosefta that has the whole Tosefta. And the Tosefta, again, Tosafot means additions or extra. The Tosefta is a whole gigantic set of teachings, Tanaitic teachings, some of which are in the Mishnah, much of which is not in the Mishnah. And people have worked on the Tosefta now in most recent. The great work on the Tosefta was done by Rabbi Shaul Lieberman, who was up at JTS, and he wrote collect the Tosefta, went through the manuscripts, and he wrote something called Tosefta Kipshuta. He has he collects the Tosefta, he goes through it very carefully. He talks about the Tosefta, he explains it's a credible piece of work. That's the Tosefta Kipshuta. So one of the questions that the academics deal with, one of the other central questions is, what is the relationship between the Tosefta on one hand and the Mishnah on the other? That's a very important question. The Tosefta, is it later? Does it reflect later teachings? Or what is the chronology here? So there's a great dispute, of course. Many believe it comes later, but there are things within the Tosefta that perhaps are reflective of earlier traditions. That's the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Braita. I did want to add one important point, though, about the study of Mishnah. And that is that over the past many years, not so many, maybe 20, 30 years, something like that, there's been an interest in looking at the Mishnah from a literary standpoint. One of the main players in this, of seeing the Mishnah as a literary work, is Rabbi Avi Wolfish. It's actually my brother-in-law. And Rabbi Wolfish, Avi's done a lot of work on this, and he also has many pupils, some of them Rosh Yeshiva, who have taken this on. And his work is confined to the Mishnah. There's nobody claiming that the Tosefta is a literary work. Tosefta seems to be a collection of things, not necessarily ordered in any literary way. But the Mishnah one can make a strong case that the Mishnah is actually a literary composition. Has a beginning, it has an end, has internal structure or structures, etc. And that, when you read it that way, suddenly you encounter and discover all kinds of other interesting things about the Mishnah. So that is, if it's correct, and it strikes me that there's a lot to be said for it, that's also very, very interesting, kind of a literary approach to the study of Mishnah. You know, about 50, 60, 70 years ago, they became quite popular. I was involved in this myself, a literary approach to the study of the Bible. Not just looking at where it comes from, etc., the sources, documents, but the final product that we have in front of us, to look at it from a literary perspective, which nowadays is, many places assume that's the case. So the Mishnah, this is more recent with the Mishnah, to see the Mishnah in the same sense. So that's the second point about the Mishnah. Now we make a third point about the Mishnah, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions, and then we'll jump into the Mishnah. And that is about what is the Mishnah? Sort of a very basic question. What is this Mishnah about? And why is there a Mishnah altogether? Because the Mishnah is what we call part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, part of this oral tradition. And when you talk about an oral tradition, the word that stands out is the word oral. That is to say, these are, Rabbi writes up, collects and writes up the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom he selects, the wisdom of his own generation and those that came before, much earlier, Shammai, Beit Hillel, Rabbi Akiva's work, Rabbi Akiva's pupils, etc. Goes all the way back. And but before he writes it down, presumably it exists, of course, but does not exist as a written document. It exists as a tradition which is passed down orally from teacher to pupil. And the Talmud assumes that that's the way it has to be. That there has to be a kind of interpretive tradition which is not written down. I mean, once you write things down, they tend to become fixed. And we've seen that in many different ways. The Siddur is the best example. Things written, once you write something in the Siddur, you do X, even if it makes no sense anymore, people still say it. It doesn't get changed. So there is I would say, a great hesitancy in the Talmud itself to write down the Talmud. The Talmud is written down. The Talmud asks a question about itself, about the permissibility of writing it down. And the Talmud's answer, which presumably is the same answer for the Mishnah, is that it became necessary to do so. Optimally, you don't do it. It became necessary to do it, perhaps because otherwise things would get lost. Things are written down in order, one of the reasons you write things down is to remember and to conserve. So Rabbi felt, of course, he's living in a difficult time. The Romans are in charge. It's after the terrible catastrophe of Beitar, maybe 50, 60 years after that. And Romans are in control. And presumably there's a fear that the tradition will be lost. So Rebbe writes this down, but it's problematic. So that's one point. The very fact of writing a Mishnah in general is interesting. But then we come to even a more basic question, which is, what is Rebbe's intention over here with the Mishnah? On one hand, the Mishnah can be seen as a kind of code, kind of legal code. Certainly, it's quite possible that that is the primary idea of the Mishnah. But, and here's the big but about this Mishnah. We'll come back to these questions hopefully later on through our study of particular mishnayot. But if it's a code, it's a very strange code. Because normally when you write a code of law, you say what the law is. You have different sections, and you simply say what the law is. But the Mishnah typically doesn't, sometimes it's simply, there's a Mishnah which has no names. It's called the Stam Mishnah. Then presumably it's telling you what the law is. Either no one disagrees or the disagreement is shunted aside, and we follow the plain Mishnah. But very often in the Mishnah, more than one opinion is recorded. And the Mishnah itself does not tell us what to follow. Often in the Mishnah, very often, there are different opinions. Sometimes Rabbi has an opinion, together with other opinions which disagree with Rabbi, the presumed author. So what is this about? What is this Mishnah actually about? If it's a code, it's a very strange code. And in addition, there's another point about the Mishnah, which is, yes, as I mentioned before, it's much more easy to understand the Mishnah than it is to understand the Gemara. Much more complicated. But even the Mishnah itself, and there are different mishnayot within the set of Mishnah, some of them are not so simple to understand. There are mishnayot that are so cryptic, and you scratch your head and say, what in the world does that mean? I mean, the Talmud tries to deal with that, but which suggests to us, perhaps, that Rebbe had something else in mind, not just a code. It certainly has aspects of a code. It certainly has aspects of, I would say, reminding us of our tradition, maybe even telling us how we should behave. On the other hand, there's something about the Mishnah that suggests that it's not just a code. That's maybe more about conserving or reminding us about the tradition in general, but the tradition itself is a tradition of disagreement, tradition of multiple possibilities. That's something that we will, again, these are basic questions about the Mishnah. I think basic questions about our tradition. And the Mishnah is a very good place to begin, because it's really, in a certain sense, the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh as something written down. These questions emerge very organically and naturally from looking at the Mishnah. Let me make one final point about the Mishnah, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. And that is one other question, which is a very basic question about the Mishnah, which was raised by the academics. Universities raised this question. And it's, actually, there's several questions. I'll mention one in particular, which is very interesting, which is, what is the relationship between the Gemara and the Mishnah? Is the Gemara simply explaining what the Mishnah meant? Or does the Mishnah perhaps mean something different? Sometimes means something different, which the Gemara is either aware of, or maybe not even aware of. But let's say the Gemara is aware of it, but it chooses to explain the Mishnah differently for its own purposes. Let me just put out there what I mean, and then I'll stop at this point and take comments and questions. Then we'll begin our study of the Mishnah in Nazir. The assumption of the Talmud is that I talked before about Tanaim and Amoraim. Tanaim are those up to the time of the Mishnah, up to Rabbi, maybe Rabbi's pupils. That's the borderline. Anything after that, they're called Amoraim. The assumption of the Talmud is that the authority of the Tana is greater than the authority of the Amora. The Amora is not allowed to disagree with the Tana. Can't disagree with the Tana. That's the assumption that the Gemara makes. The problem is the Talmud, which is replete with disagreements, and very often one Amora will ask the other Amora, how can you say X? I have a Mishnah or a Braita or a Tosefta against you, and you can't disagree with the earlier source, so that proves that you're wrong. So the Amora will say, yes, you have, the Amora can answer in various ways. One way is to say, yes, that Braita is against me, but I have a different Braita that supports me. That's one possibility. But very often, that's not the answer. Very often the answer is, yes, the Mishnah says that, but the Mishnah is talking about a specific case. Sometimes the case that the Amora claims the Mishnah is talking about seems extraordinarily far-fetched. And the question is, when you have such answers, that's called an ukimta. The question is, what is the Amora really thinking? Does the Amora really believe that that's what the Mishnah means? They're not talking about the normal case, one very wild case, one extremely unusual case. Or is that simply a way to say, in effect, okay, it sounds like the Mishnah is against me, but I have a way to explain the Mishnah which doesn't contradict me. But in point of fact, no one really believes that's what the Mishnah meant in the first place. The academics assume that to be obvious, that when you have these ukimtas that run all the way through Shas, back and forth, that's not really what the Mishnah means, that the Mishnah means something different. But this is a way to resolve the problem of how can the Amora disagree with the Mishnah. So this is a very fundamental question. It's a big question. Professor Gaffney, who's taught here at Drisha several times, it's one of the areas that he deals with. Pshuto Shel Mishnah, he has a book, and it's a very, very, very interesting topic. So I simply put out, before we get to the actual Mishnah, I just wanted to raise, first of all, to highlight why Mishnah is centrally important, and then to raise some of the really basic questions about this core text of our tradition, its relationship to what comes later, its relationship to what comes earlier. There's a lot more to say about this. But simply, I thought it would be useful as we begin our journey together in the study of Mishnah to put out there some of the core issues. Okay, we're going to start soon. Let me just stop here for a moment and take comments or questions. Other things will come up in the course of our study, but let me just stop here for a moment. Any comments or questions, that would be a good time to speak up.
And again, you please, if you don't want to unmute yourself or you're not in a place where you can, feel free to ask questions in chat. If you are an attendee and you have a question, if you ask permission to unmute, I'm happy to unmute you. Yeah. No takers?
No takers? Okay, no takers. So we'll begin. Now, let's begin. We'll start now. We have about 20, 25 minutes now, and we meet 6 times. We're not going to do all the mishnaiot and Tractate Nazir. There are probably about 70 of them. That's not possible. So I'm going to select mishnaiot as we go along. To repeat, though, what I said in the very beginning, what I'm interested in these sessions is looking to see how the Mishnah understands the Nazirite. For those who were here previously, in terms of how the picture of the Nazir within the Bible, that is the Torah in chapter 6 of Bamidbar, and the Bible, because there's one main Nazir of the Bible. There are 4 chapters about that Nazir in the Bible. His name is Shimshon. Shimshon is the Nazir, the great Nazir. He's the central Nazir of the Bible, obviously. We talked about other possible Nazir figures as well. But we'll see what the Mishnah does with the Nazirite, how the Mishnah presents the Nazirite, how the Mishnah presents Shimshon, and how the Mishnah sees the restrictions of the Nazirite, and how the Mishnah sees the Nazirite in general as it emerges from a selected Mishnayot of Tractate Nazir. Let's begin with the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah is Kol Kinuyei Nazirut Kinazirut. A kinui is like a slang in modern Hebrew, kind of a nickname. It's a word that is not strictly speaking a definition of Nazir, but it reflects the idea of Nazirut. So we'll see. That's the beginning of the Mishnah. Kol kinuyei Nazirut Kinazirut. Ha'omer hey, if someone said, I will be, harei zeh Nazir. That person is a Nazir. Oh, hey, Naver, or I'll be beautiful. Nazir. I'll explain this in a minute. Nazik, Naziach, Pziach, harei zeh Nazir. If someone says, I want to be a Nazik, or a Naziach, or a Paziach, it doesn't say the word Nazir. It says a different word. This is a Nazir. Hareini Kazeh, I want to be like that one, presumably like pointing to a Nazir. Hareini Misalseo, Hareini Michalkeo, I want to play with my hair, I want to arrange my hair. Hareilai Lishaleach Pera, Hareze Nazir. I want to grow my hair long. The intention is this person intends to be a Nazir, that's our presumption, and the person becomes a Nazir. Hareilai Tziporim, I want to bring birds. I'll explain in a minute. Rabbi Meir Omer Nazir. Rabbi Meir says such a person has accepted Nazirut upon oneself. The Chachamim Omrim Eino Nazir, but the Chachamim disagree. Here we have in the first Mishnah disagreement. Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Rabbi Meir says this language, Harei like Siporim, I want to bring two birds. That means you're a Nazir. Chachamim disagree. No, that's not the language of a Nazir. Okay, and let's begin with this Mishnah over here. The Mishnah talks about two different things. There are two different ideas found in Mishnah number one. One is if you make a kind of incomplete statement, a statement which doesn't say the word Nazir, but it's a statement that given the context of it, we can understand from the context that the intention of the one making the vow is a Nazir. Now, let's presume we haven't asked the person yes or no. What if the person says afterwards, I didn't mean it? That's a separate question in the Mishnah. But in order to become a Nazir, you need a particular language. And the question the Mishnah deals with is what kind of language is considered sufficient in order to become a Nazir? And there are two different statements that the Mishnah is making in this cryptic Mishnah. One has to do with statements that are contextual. A Nazir walks in front of me. I want to be like that guy, right? I want to be beautiful. Naveh in certain contexts means, apparently according to the Mishnah, could refer to becoming a Nazir. So that works, even though you didn't actually say the word Nazir. And the Gemara not here, maybe here as well, but in the Darim, in the previous tractate, the first Mishnah of the Darim is virtually identical to the first Mishnah in Tractate Nazir. So what they call a yad, like a handle. I didn't say the word Nazir, but I said things that intimate that I intend to be a Nazir. And the Gemara will discuss handle, a yad, how obvious must it be? Where do we draw the line and say that's so far-fetched? It doesn't qualify as a statement about Nazirut. So the Gemara has two kinds of yadayim, but that's one thing. But then we have another statement in the Mishnah, which does not appear to be a kinui at all, but rather nazik, naziach, and paziach. Hareze and nazir. Nazik, naziach, paziach. What does that mean? So that actually is a kinui, I would say. In other words, there's a yad and there's a kinui. A yad means make a statement, and contextually it can be seen as a statement which is sufficient for the vow of the Nazirite. As I said, this Mishnah is parallel to the first Mishnah in the Darim of vows. You become a Nazir by taking a vow. This is critical here, and that's the idea. It's a Nazirite vow. Now the question is, a vow is all about language. So there are two kinds of statements that could work. One is a kind of slang. That's nazik, paziach, naziach. Either it's a common slang that people use. According to one view in the Talmud, it's certain dialects say it this way, or it's a slang word, or it's a word that the rabbinic authority said is good enough. You can use this other kind of formulation. But that's the question of the word Nazir. Nazir, he didn't say Nazir, he said Nazik. Okay, Nazik is close enough to Nazir. It's a slang for Nazir. That's one thing. Then there's another kind of statement in the Mishnah, which is contextual. That's called the yad. So either of these two things, according to the first Mishnah in Nazir, can work. And for our purposes, what's important is it's exactly parallel to the first Mishnah in Tractate Nedarim. And that's important for us, because you see straight up from the beginning of this tractate, the focus on the Nazir as a vow is something you take upon yourself. A neder, as understood by the tradition, is something that is not required to do. You're not obligated, but you took upon yourself. So the Nazir is something you voluntarily take upon. That's the focus of the very first Mishnah. You're not obligated at all. In fact, not only not obligated at all, but we'll see, maybe not even a good idea. But you've decided to do it. What kind of language is sufficient? Okay, that's the first part of Mishnah number one. Then we have a very interesting disagreement at the end of this Mishnah between Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is one of the chief, maybe the chief pupil of Rabbi Akiva. And there's a lot of stories about Rabbi Meir in the Talmud. He is seen as, from a certain perspective, a problematic person. He's also seen as perhaps the most brilliant of Rabbi Akiva's pupils. And I'll come back to Rabbi Meir in a moment. So what did the person say? Harei olai tziporim. I want to bring, harei olai, I am obligated to bring tziporim of birds. Rabbi Meir says this is sufficient language. We presume the person means I want to be a Nazir. The Chachamim say no. Now the question is, why saying I want to bring birds, tziporim, why should that work to become a Nazir? What do birds have to do with becoming a Nazir? So what's very curious is this, and we'll get to this next week, I hope. Big topic. So the Torah, when the Torah talks about the Nazir, and we'll see this in the Mishnah number 2, which is very central Mishnah in the Tractate. That's for next week. But in the Torah, you become a Nazir for a certain amount of time. I say, I'm going to be a Nazir for the next 3 months. Okay, I'm a Nazir. And there's certain rules and regulations and restrictions that the Nazir has. We'll come back to that as well. But what happens if one of them is I can't come in contact with any dead bodies, even my own family? No funerals, no dead bodies, no graves. What if I did? Either on purpose or by accident, totally by accident. Not only by accident, even if I was required to do it, you see a body in the middle of the street, you're obligated to take care of that body for the mate mitzvah. Obligated. The Nazir is obligated. But when the Nazir becomes this ritually impure by coming in contact with the dead, then the Torah says that the Nazir's Nazirut stops. Everything you counted till now, all the days you counted till now, counted 2 months already, 1 month to go. The Nazirut is batel, is null and void, and I have to bring 3 sacrifices, and then I start the Nazirut all over again. The Nazir who became Tameh mate, the Nazirut is over, and then we start over again, but you bring sacrifices. 2 of the sacrifices that are brought are birds. So Rabbi Meir says, it's a very interesting idea. When I want to bring birds, that Rabbi Meir says the intention over here is in the case that a Nazir who became Tameh brings 2 birds, either to complete the Nazirut that was performed till now or to start the new Nazirut. Rabbi Meir thinks that for some reason that qualifies as a Nazirite vow. I'll come back to this later on. I have some thoughts about this. It's a very interesting idea. The rabbis say, no, that doesn't mean birds. First of all, the normal Nazir who does not become ritually impure doesn't bring birds. Bring animals, not birds. So what does that have to do with birds? So they say, no, this is not a Nazir. What it probably means is the person said, I want to bring a sacrifice to the temple of 2 birds. You can do that. You can bring voluntary sacrifices, but it doesn't qualify you as a Nazir. So here we have a dispute, Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Now, the Mishnah does not tell you what to follow. What position should one follow? The Mishnah says nothing of the sort. But here we come to a very interesting point about the Mishnah. It's actually an interesting point about the Mishnah and about the Gemara. The Gemara assumes that when Rabbi Meir has a disagreement with anybody, that we never follow the view of Rabbi Meir. And certainly, and this is not in the Mishnah, but the Gemara assumes that majority rules. When people argue against Chachamim, the unnamed rabbis, not any one particular rabbi, but the group of rabbis, the presumption of the Talmud is halacha kechachamim. So there are 2 reasons not to follow Rabbi Meir. A, he's Rabbi Meir, and we don't follow him. And B, even if we sometimes do follow Rabbi Meir, you wouldn't follow Rabbi Meir against the majority view. The majority is a very central idea in the Talmud in general, and also when it comes to halacha. Yachid v'rabim halacha karabim, says the Talmud. We follow the majority. Why don't we follow Rabbi Meir? Because Rabbi Meir seems to be, in certain sense, suspect. In fact, one of the terms for Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah is the word acherim. He's called acherim. Now we know that Rabbi Meir, one of his two rabbis, yes, actually three rabbis, one of them was Elisha ben Avuya, the apostate Elisha ben Avuya, was called in the Talmud Acher. And Rabbi Meir studied with Acher. He loved Acher. So Rabbi Meir is called Acherim. So we don't follow Rabbi Meir lahalacha. That's clear. But it turns out it's not clear, because we have another view, remarkable statement of the Talmud. It's not in the Mishnah, but I wanted to mention this because it's actually very interesting. And that is, the Mishnah often has no disputes registered. Many Mishnayot are simply statements with no names attached to them. No names. That is called by the Talmud a Stam Mishnah. Stam Mishnah. Stam means unnamed Mishnah. Most of the Mishnayot, I don't know if it's most, but a huge number of Mishnayot are Stam. The Talmud makes the following statement. We always follow the Stam Mishnah. But who is the author of the Stam Mishnah? Says the Talmud, Stam Mishnah Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the author of the Stam Mishnah. Because most of the Mishnayot are an expression of the viewpoint of Rabbi Meir. So we come to a very paradoxical idea. On one hand, we never follow Rabbi Meir when he's named. Rabbi Meir Omer, forget it. We don't follow. We do record it, but we don't follow it as far as halacha is concerned. On the other hand, we always follow the Stam Mishnah, the unnamed Mishnah. But who is the author of the unnamed Mishnah? We have no idea. But the Gemara says, Stam matnita in Rabbi Meir. That's, I think, a remarkable statement, something to think about. And it's relevant to the question, one of the pieces of the introduction, which is what is Rebbe's thinking here altogether? In terms of, what is this book? What is this Mishnah? Is it just a code? Is it bringing different opinions? We'll come back to this question over and over again. Here's some remarkable statement. Rabbi Meir, no, says the Talmud. But Stam Masnisen, yes, of course. But who's the author? Rabbi Meir. Strange. Okay, let me stop you for a moment. Take any comments or questions. No one has any comments or questions? Anybody speak up?
I have a question.
Yep.
Please speak.
I have a million questions. Go ahead, yeah.
Forgive my ignorance, but are the Gemara and the Talmud the same thing, or are they different?
Same.
Same.
When I'm speaking of the Talmud, well, when you talk about the Talmud sometimes, it means the Mishnah plus the Gemara. When I'm speaking about the Talmud, I mean the Gemara.
I see. Okay.
The
Thank you.
Mishnah and the Gemara, we call the whole thing the Talmud, but it's the Gemara. The Gemara is, of course, the Gemara is playing off the Mishnah to some extent. There are things in the Gemara that the Gemara is itself fascinating, how it's set up and arranged. It's very complicated. But anyway, when I'm saying Talmud, I'm referring to the Gemara.
And one other question, the legends, the stories, for instance, that like the story of Abraham when he was a little boy killing the idols. What book is that?
That will be found in two different places. I didn't mention this before. I talked about Medrash Halacha, like this, but there's also Medrash Agada. That Medrash Rabbah is the main one. Tanchuma, there's collections of Midrashim. The most prominent amongst them would be the Medrash Rabbah, which is on the 5 books of the Torah and on the Megillot. But there are other collections of Midrash as well, the Yalkutim. There was many are much related collections. Now, some of these Agadot, some of these stories are found in the Talmud itself, in the Gemara. About a quarter of the Talmud is actually stories. It's actually Agadot. Talmud is very complicated. And when you're studying Talmud, at least when some people study Talmud, They ask themselves the question, what is the relationship between the stories and the law? That's another very interesting question, which has emerged again in the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years as a very central element of the study of Talmud. These are all big questions. But anyway, I'm referring to the Gemara. So
Okay,
this is, right, okay. We have a few more minutes. Let me just conclude. We'll start next week with Mishnah number 2, because it's a very important Mishnah. But I want just to begin it now. We have 5 minutes though. Hareini Nazir min hachartzanim umin hazagim umin hatiglachat umin hatuma. This is Mishnah number 2. If someone said, I am a Nazir from, I am refrained from, forbidden to eat the peels, the seeds, and the peels, skins or peels. I am refrained from cutting my hair. I'm refrained from coming in contact with the dead, that which would make me tamei. Harezeh Nazir, v'chol diktukei nazirut Allah. Such a person is a Nazir, and all the laws of the Nazir apply. In other words, the Nazir has certain restrictions. Can't drink wine, can't eat grapes or grape products, can't cut his hair or her hair, and cannot come into contact with the dead. These are the rules of the Mishnah says, if a person said, I accept upon myself, I'm a Nazir from any of these 4, and didn't mention the other 3, that is sufficient to become a Nazir. It's not worse than what we call the yad, a handle. You don't have to say I'm a Nazir and mention every single restriction. I'm a Nazir from grape skins. That means you're a Nazir for everything, not just grape skins. You're a Nazir completely. Harezeh Nazir, and all the laws of Nazirut are upon this person. I'll stop. I'm not going to finish the Mishnah now. Next week we'll start with this Mishnah, Hareini Kishimshon. I want to make a different point, though, about this Mishnah, which has to do with the way the Mishnah is set up. One of the great puzzles of Mishnah, is the following. If I were writing a Mishnah, I wouldn't start this way. I might start by saying it's a vow, yes. The thing I would say next is, what does it mean to be a Nazir? What may the Nazir not do? And I would have said, well, the Nazir can't drink wine, the Nazir can't eat grapes, the Nazir can't eat grape skins or seeds, the Nazir can't come in contact with the dead, the Nazir can't cut his hair. That's what I would have said. And then I would have said afterwards, what about if one accepted one of these things, are you a Nazir or not? That would make perfect sense. But this weird thing is that the Mishnah, chapter 1, Mishnah 2, assumes that you know these things. It doesn't bother telling you. But when you get to chapter 6 of this tractate, then suddenly the Mishnah says, this is what a Nazir can't do. Shosha meaning. So this raises the big question. One of the big questions about Mishnah is, what is the structuring? Why did Rabbi structure the Mishnah in this bizarre way? And it's not just over here. It runs through all the mishnayot. When you study the tractate about divorce, it never discusses divorce till the last chapter. I mean, what does it mean what does this get involved? What does it get? What does it have to say? That's in the chapter 9. The last chapter is 8 or 9. I think it's chapter 9. What? Why do you start this way? It starts with these wild cases in the beginning. So this raises a big question about it's one of the core questions that people studying Mishnah have. Why is it arranged in this sense? Obviously, the Mishnah assumes that you know these things, and it's found in the Torah, but why not spell it out? The Rambam, who wrote the Mishnah Torah, he wrote the Mishnah Torah on all the 6 Siddharim, everything. He includes everything, the Rambam, except he orders it differently. No one ever existed more methodical than the Rambam. Rambam is methodical beyond belief, is unbelievable. But he starts off, and typically he rearranges the Mishnah the way any normal person, rational person would rearrange it. What is this order of the Mishnah in the first place? That's an interesting question. Maybe we'll come back to this. I'm not sure I have a good answer, but it's something that people that study Mishnah wrestle with. So next week, what we'll do is we'll start with Mishnah number 2, and we'll encounter something very interesting about the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah's interpreting Nazir in a certain way. And we get to Mishnah number 2, we'll deal with Shimshon. What does the Mishnah make of Shimshon? So we'll talk about that next week. Okay, again, this is all, I haven't really taught Mishnah ever. It's a fascinating study. I hope I'll learn a lot from it. And again, we'll pick up next week with the second Mishnah, and we'll move forward, and we'll have to jump around, obviously. We're not going to do 70 Mishnayot. Maybe we'll do 10. But I want to get some of that, I think, the core idea of Tractate Nazir through a study of selected Mishnayot. Okay, so I'll stop at this point. Again, if anybody has comments or questions, you can always email me at dsilber@risha.org. And all this is in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And this is one of our many Sfirazvan offerings, which you can find out more about on our website, which I have linked to in the chat. Coming up next, we have a class at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, conversations on the Parsha, where Drisha faculty have weekly investigations into Parshat HaShavua. This week, we have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Leah Sarna and Ms. Sophia Stepansky. It's not too late to sign up. And with that, see you all next week. Same Zoom link, same time.